This is America, and from inside the Oval Office here at the White House, traditional alliances around the world are being reshaped. For decades, Washington has built its security strategy on a post-Cold War scenario. Now they're taking a much more flexible approach. Alliances, well, they're much more transactional, and they're based on networks, not on blocks. In a few minutes' time, we'll be asking what's driving this change. But first, let's go to our Washington, D.C. studio and Alex Marquardt.
Thank you, Richard. America's alliances have been the backbone of U.S. foreign policy for decades. Now it is being quickly and not so quietly reshaped. The Trump administration sent a questionnaire to NATO allies earlier this month, testing them on their level of support for the U.S. We'll have an exclusive look at that document later in the show. It's another sign of Trump's transactional approach, which has left many allies reeling and, frankly, rethinking how much they can rely on Washington. Let's get back to Richard Gaisford, who breaks down the new global dynamics.
Despite the president's obvious disdain for the NATO alliance, US forces have continued to train this summer alongside European counterparts. Well, here they're testing resilience in the Baltic region. It's an exercise to strengthen warfighting capabilities and to guarantee the safe passage of shipping. Flash! But despite a shared ideal of defending NATO's eastern flank, the US has allowed other countries to take the lead on Ukraine. The coalition of the willing has one obvious missing partner. The US stands apart from the effort led by Britain and France to support Volodymyr Zelensky, leaving European countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and Japan to work more closely together. US indifference towards Ukraine's forced it to stand on its own feet. Having developed new drone technology, Ukraine's now doing deals around the world with seemingly no preferential treatment for the US. And with European countries now concerned the president won't protect them from attack, the French have offered to create a nuclear umbrella. It would cover Poland, Britain, Germany, Belgium, Denmark, Greece, the Netherlands and Sweden, and would be a move away from an American deterrent that's been in place since the Cold War. And in a sign of shifting priorities, 5,000 US troops will be moved out of Germany in the coming months. That's a reduction of some 14%. The president's also demanded that US involvement in South Korean military exercises is substantially reduced, although by how much won't be clear until the end of Operation Ulchi Freedom Shield at the end of next week. Donald Trump claims, without offering recent proof, that he has a very good relationship with Kim Jong-un. The president says he wants to be unthreatening and respectful towards North Korea, which continues to send men and missiles to Russia for Vladimir Putin to use against Ukraine. All this is happening as the US war with Iran continues in the Middle East, leaving allies there questioning where they stand in terms of protection. Despite US air defences, they've seen some key assets and infrastructure around the Gulf hit in Iranian attacks, with Saudi Arabia signing a joint defence pact with Turkey and Pakistan in Mecca. The Saudis are providing the money, Turkey a NATO-ready force, and Pakistan a nuclear arsenal.
And here to discuss the future of American alliances are Heino Clinick. He is a former director of Army International Affairs at Pentagon, and Jim Townsend, who is a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy. Can't think of two better people to discuss how these alliances are quickly shifting, and frankly, many of them falling apart. In this second Trump administration, it really has been emphasized how transactional the U.S. president is. But when you look, Heino, at what this administration has done in Trump's second go-around, doesn't this go beyond transactionality in that the aim is to shrink America's global footprint?
So that's not the way I would characterize it. And I would also say that transactionalism, I think, is a standard common denominator of realpolitik, has been, as far as I can remember. I think what is obviously at the fore of the Trump administration's priorities, and it's been spelled out in the national security strategy as well as in the national defense strategy, that they're looking not just at burden sharing, but they're looking at burden shifting. They want our allies, whether they be our European allies or our allies in the Indo-Pacific, to do more. And that is to allow the United States the strategic flexibility to, whether it's to, again, focus on the Western Hemisphere, which has become the priority theater in terms of, again, those strategic documents, but as well as to be able to ensure the capability, if needed, to deter the Chinese in the Indo-Pacific.
Asking allies to do more. NATO, of course, is the easiest example, asking them to spend some 5% of their GDP on defense spending. Those NATO allies have started spending more. The argument that we hear from the U.S., Jim, that allies need to be more self-reliant and do more, that is a relatively easy argument to make. But what does the U.S. lose when alliances like NATO are diminished or the U.S. is simply left out?
Well, it's something that I hope it doesn't happen. That's not going to be in NATO's future. What I'm hoping is that as there's more balance that comes to the relationship in terms of defense in Europe, that will bring more strength. You've got the U.S. coping with a lot of other problems. You've got the Europeans who are trying to build back up and try to at least fill a lot of gaps that the U.S. is going to believe as they begin to shift around. So if we can get some type of balance where the allies are doing enough so that the U.S. can go off and do other things around the globe, hopefully that's going to make us a stronger alliance. So at the end of the day, all the administrations have talked about the allies doing more, stepping up. Putin and Trump together have managed to get the allies to be spending more. I think that's going to be a strong thing if the medicine doesn't kill the patient. Mm-hmm. So what I worry about is more the rhetoric that's behind a lot of this coming out of the White House for other reasons, and whether it's Greenland or other things like that, that's what can bring weakness to the alliance that you're referring to, if that undercuts unity or something along those lines. But getting us stronger on both sides of the Atlantic, that's a good thing.
But when you see, as Richard just pointed out in his story there, that, say, the French are proposing this nuclear umbrella, doesn't that just say that our closest allies don't trust being under the American umbrella?
Well, there is a trust issue here that's happened with Greenland, and whether that was the intent or not, that's how it's evolved now in Europe, with most of the allies saying, look, we don't trust you, we don't think you're committed, you're walking away from the alliance, and this is why we're going to get stronger, is because we don't think you're going to be there. That's the kind of thinking that really undercuts us. And so what we've got to do is try to wash that away and bring us back to the point where it's good for them and us, for us both to be strong, and not one based on mistrust. But we do have this mistrust problem. The nuclear aspect of it that France has talked about, and Germany, UK are part of that as well. At the end of the day, I don't think that's going to go anywhere. I think there's a part of me that says I'm glad for Germany to be more interested in nuclear things. Collaboration between the UK and France on nuclear things isn't a bad thing, but it's not going to replace the United States. That's for sure. It'll be impossible to do that. It's something that's not necessarily going to deter the Russians either, because it's so small. So go have meetings and understand each other's approaches and do exercises together. That's all great. But I don't see it being a substitute for the United States, and we can't let them think that they need a substitute. Mm-hmm. They've got to understand that what they're doing is okay, but we've got to make sure that U.S. extended deterrence is going to remain alive and well. And so far, the White House hasn't said anything against it.
We saw during Trump 1, Heino, a lot of allies, particularly Europeans, who were treating that administration, hoping that that administration was a bit of a blip when it came to the transatlantic relationship. In your view, is it now certain that the world order has changed for good?
So I think the world order certainly has evolved. And I think with respect to the alliance and the future of the alliance, to Jim's point, I think a lot of these things are only going to make it stronger. Individual member states being less reliant, less dependent on American military capabilities, I think make the alliance as a whole stronger. We've seen that, again, not to exactly take what Jim said, with respect to Putin and Trump pushing NATO to spend more. But the reality is, though, that it's taken a war in Europe the Russian invasion of Ukraine to the NATO member states to actually spend the 2% of GDP that they committed to in 2014. They actually finally met that objective in 2025, except for Spain, that has yet to meet it. And now the commitment of 5%. It's taken a war in Europe and badgering by the United States for the Europeans to finally step up.
I understand that argument that you can strengthen an alliance that way. But on the flip side, a lot of the rules are being broken. You mentioned Greenland a moment ago. Do you feel like the norms, the standards, that rules-based order is at the very least fracturing, if not falling apart?
So I did not mention Greenland. I think that some of the rhetoric, of course, is problematic. And when you have some of these conversations that should be happening behind closed doors, through diplomatic and official channels, making them out into the public domain, that is not helpful. But let's also remember that American criticism of NATO, American presidential criticism of NATO, started with President Eisenhower when he criticized the individual member states not stepping up, doing enough. This is a perennial problem that we've seen throughout the existence of the alliance. But I would say this, that those of us that are in the defense ecosystem, we still agree with Winston Churchill when he said the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without allies. And I think the Trump administration is still committed to its allies, NATO, particularly based on what we heard come out of the Ankara summit just last month.
There are major concerns, of course, from the Europeans, from the Asians about what the U.S. may or may not do if push comes to shove. Jim, in that kind of environment, with some of those fracturing, that fracturing, the daylight, what can bad actors do? What do you expect them to do?
Well, if bad actors misunderstand what they're hearing and what they're saying, if they are seeing in Moscow that the alliance is getting weaker, the alliance is fracturing, the U.S. is walking away, the allies don't have enough munitions, the U.S. doesn't have enough munitions, and that becomes something that emboldens them to do something they better not do in terms of something against an ally or something against NATO because they feel they can get away with it. That would be the fear. What's happening is there's a mix of voices coming out of the West right now, because you're absolutely right. There is a lot of concern about trust, a lot of concern about NATO credibility. But on the other hand, there was just completed a two-day pretty big exercise off of Kaliningrad that got the Russians quite stirred up. And that's something that I was surprised to see because the U.S. was part of it, because I've been hearing the noise coming out of the White House, too, that we weren't going to be doing those kinds of things. And there we are. So it's a mixed message. And I think what has to happen is both on the Atlantic, at NATO, as well as here in the U.S., we've got to have a more united voice on this. And I think they try. At summits, they try to get a more united view on things. But I think it's the rhetoric coming out of the administration that is not helping things. And it'd be good if we can somehow get that in line with what allies are thinking in terms of the importance of NATO and the strength and unity of NATO.
I want to get your take on this remarkable document that the U.S. is putting to its NATO allies. It is a three-page questionnaire put to these 31 allies by the Pentagon that reads something like a loyalty test, asking them how supportive they are of U.S. policy, whether they've placed any restrictions on U.S. troops. I was sent this document by an official who was on the distribution for it. Bloomberg News previously reported on it, but we are showing some of this document for the first time. And at the top of this long list of questions, the Pentagon says, quote, responses to these questions will enable the Department of War to provide leaders with fully informed analysis of different posture and basing options. In short, where the U.S. could pull troops out of, where bases could be repositioned. I want to get your take on three of the questions. I want to highlight these three. They say, what, if any, restrictions has the country placed on U.S. access, basing, and overflight? Has the country been publicly supportive of U.S. foreign policy priorities, including ongoing initiatives in Europe, the Middle East, and the Western Hemisphere? Has the country shown alignment with the U.S. approach to strong, clear, and quiet? That is a mantra that has been expressed by the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. Heino, your reaction to these questions?
So force posture reviews are things that happen periodically, nothing out of the ordinary there. As a matter of fact, during the Obama administration, we pulled, I think it was a heavy brigade out of Germany. And replaced it with rotational brigades. So there's nothing new about that. With respect to perhaps questionnaires being presented to U.S. officials to guide conversations with foreign partners. I think that is also routine. Frankly, what it demonstrates to me is that the Pentagon, I'm guessing Office of the Secretary Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, is trying to get input from embassies in the NATO partner states as well as from the U.S. mission to NATO to try to inform decision-making here. I don't think that that's anything, frankly.
But to ask them if they've been publicly supportive and if they align with this slogan that Hegseth has come up with, that's notable, isn't it?
Perhaps one question out of 31. Not sure how, if I would necessarily focus on that one. The ABO question, though, the basing and overflight, I think that's critical.
And that's a clear reference to Iran, right?
Absolutely. And this is an issue that, frankly, I'm sure Jim dealt with when he was DASD. I dealt with it when I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia as well. This is something that is a prerequisite for having forces forward deployed. If we can't use them in case of a contingency, there's obviously no reason to have a base there.
Jim, what's your take? What does it tell you about where the U.S. wants NATO to go?
Well, it was very interesting. I had read the Bloomberg as well, and I had one thing in mind in terms of a questionnaire. I assumed that the nations, the allies, were going to have to fill these out. But it sounds like to me when I saw the document that it was something for an American to fill out. And so I think there's been some confusion somewhere where these documents were sent to the allies and they weren't probably supposed to get it. But that aside.
But at the very least, it was supposed to be a survey of those allies.
Yes. And I think there is an aspect of it. Well, in doing a review of force posture, I mean, you do. These kinds of issues do come up in the conversation, Democrat or Republican. These kinds of issues of where does the nation stand? How able are we able to have access to the base? Are there any constraints on us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Those things can be important and are part of the debate. I think we do know, though, this administration cares very much about loyalty, whether it's their own people or the allies particularly. And, President Trump has talked to the allies pretty sternly about his expectations for their loyalty and support for the U.S. So I'm not so surprised to see these questions discussed that way because we know that's important to the president. But at the end of the day, what I'm hoping is we're going to see a review based on U.S. military need and less on these things. These are political things. They go either way. I mean, I've done base rights, and there's some places where we are constrained, and there's some places where we're not. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to have to be what does the U.S. military feel they need to have on the continent, and that takes into account what NATO would like to see and what other allies like to see, what the Joint Staff, the European Command want to see, what the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs wants to see, and so the report that eventually goes into the political side of the Pentagon and then up to the White House. They'll put the political sheen on it, but I'm hoping what comes out of the early stages of this review is the military requirement, and we try to meet that and keep that in mind.
So that's NATO and Europe. Heino, let's talk about Asia. Certainly, some of the Asian allies are rattled as well. Taiwan, South Korea. Now we've heard in the past few days the president expressing hope to get together with Kim Jong-un. How is the Trump administration realigning things with Asian counterparts?
So I think with respect to defense spending, for instance, the administration is fairly content, especially with Taiwan's defense spending, and with South Korea, Japan, and Australia, perhaps less so. What we've seen within the last 48 hours or so with the president posting that he, in essence, wanted the most recent U.S.-South Korean exercises curtailed in order to perhaps facilitate an initial or another opportunity to engage with the leader of North Korea. I think that caught a lot of people by surprise, candidly. Not completely out of character for the president, and it happened in the first administration where we've curtailed exercises as well. Candidly, I don't think this has a long-term effect on readiness. I think it, again, though, is kind of a mixed message, if you will. The irony about South Korea, of course, is that the South Korean government is led by a left-of-center party that just last week the President Lee of South Korea himself set out another olive branch to the North Koreans to try to bring them back to the negotiating table. I think in the long run, the North Koreans are not interested in any kind of dialogue with the president at this point, because they saw during the first term that the president was not going to give the types of concessions that Pyongyang is demanding.
Do you see a bit of the opposite effect, Jim, in Latin America, where if the U.S. is being a little bit cooler with the European allies, you see through the Don Roe doctrine a much warmer embrace of Latin American countries?
That's a great question. And I was expecting, with the inaugural address and the various reviews that have come out from the administration, I was expecting to see a lot more programs being done in Latin America. Bilateral programs, U.S. Colombia, U.S. Peru, a lot more exercises and training. We saw Venezuela, of course, and Panama. They are able to, deal with the Chinese influence there, and they're dealing with drugs in terms of coming out of Latin America. But my guess is a lot of the Latin American nations don't know what's expected of them. What does the president want? I'm not sure what the communications are like between the White House, say, and Latin America, Central America. Or, there's the focus now on Cuba. So it seems the focus countries in Latin America are those where there are problems that we have, whether it's Cuba, whether it's Venezuela, drugs. But the other countries, I don't think there's any embracing yet. I think the Latin American countries are saying, what do you want to do? Are we going to have some programs or something? And I haven't seen something coming out of the administration that says, this is the plan for Latin America by country. This is the things that we're going to do. Yeah. I've got the best ambassadors down there. I've gone to Congress asking for $2 billion in assistance, and we're going to go down. And I haven't seen that yet. But I think the administration's been distracted by Iran and other things. So I think the whole program and approach to Latin America has kind of gone quiet.
Can I add something real quick? The Southcom commander was just in Ecuador yesterday. If you look at the electoral kind of winds that have been flowing in the Western Hemisphere, Colombia went to a center-right party. Ecuador went to a center-right party. So you can say that, there are things amiss in the Western Hemisphere, and the presidents of Colombia and Ecuador have absolutely embraced the Trump administration's agenda for the hemisphere.
One of the biggest pieces of alliance news, if you will, and to keep bouncing around the world, is what we just saw from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan in terms of this mutual defense pact. It's got a very similar clause to Article 5 that NATO has. Turkey is in NATO. There is a strategic defense agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia. Heino, do you see this kind of strategic alliance forming in quote-unquote previous normal times, or is this a reflection of what we're seeing now with the U.S.?
Well, overarchingly, I'm an advocate, candidly, for some of these mini-laterals and multilaterals. Those terms of art both came to the fore during the Biden administration. So countries aligning themselves not necessarily with an American leadership role. So I'm not against those. I don't think it's mutually exclusive from the partnerships and alliances that we have, whether, like you cited, the relationship the United States has with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, or, of course, with the NATO ally of Turkey. I don't think these things are bad for the United States, and the more countries align along certain common principles that also serve American interests, I see that as a net positive.
Do you see, Jim, the United States coming to the defense of a country under attack now, except for perhaps Israel? Are the other countries are certainly doubting that the cavalry will come?
Well, I think that's what we talked about a little bit earlier about the trust issue and the perceptions that the U.S. is walking away from alliances, whether it's South Korea, whether it's NATO, this type of thing. I don't think we're there yet. I don't. Just speaking about Europe, I've been asked many times by allies, "Do you think the Americans will come if something happens?" And I'm not at a place now where I can say no. I think we are in a place where we will show up. We are exercising, we're training. We'll see where the force posture, what that tells us in terms of the study they're doing and what the force posture looks like in the US, in NATO, in Europe. But I think we are still exercising. We're still poised. We're still planning. We're still doing those things that we've always done to make sure that we can come to their aid if something happens. What that looks like, if something were to happen, the Russians were to put pressure on Estonia or something, will the 82nd Airborne go in, or will the president pick up the phone and call Putin and say, hey, listen, before we start shooting at each other, let's see if we can make a deal? I mean, maybe he takes that approach. I don't know. But I do know that there are some very important exercises that have happened in NATO that have included all the U.S. players. And so I think we're still there. And if I were talking to the alliance, I would say, look, hang with us. We're not going anywhere. And Putin needs to know that.
And if I may, it's not just a question of us coming. We're already there. We have tens of thousands of troops in Europe. We have 28,500 troops in South Korea. We have tens of thousands of troops in Japan, amongst other places. So it's not just a question of coming. We are already there.
But they are being moved around, and they are taking a deeper look at where these troops should be.
And I think that that's an absolute rational thing to do as the national security environment evolves.
All right. Well, it certainly is a remarkable moment. There are a lot of jitters out there, but as you say, there's some positives that come out of it as well, where the U.S. is stepping up and telling its allies they need to do more, and we are in fact seeing that. So it is a remarkable moment for the U.S. on the global stage, not just in NATO and Europe, but well beyond. Heino Clinick and Jim Townsend, thank you both very much for coming in and sharing your expertise today.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it. And that's all from myself and the team here in Washington. I want to hand it back to Richard Gaisford and Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha.
Well, that's it for this edition of This is America. We'll be back on Thursday looking at the truth behind the historic drop in American crime levels. That's at 18:30 GMT, 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time here in the United States. For now, though, from outside the White House, it's goodbye.